Przewalski's horse is the last surviving wild horse. All other horses, domestic horses, are all, though they look quite different, are all the same species. Even the American West Mustangs, the ponies in the Eastern Shore, these are all the same. While the Przewalski's horse, also known as the P horse, is distinct, it has a different number of chromosomes with 66 rather than 64 of the domestic horses. And it's also never been tamed. And I heard a theory once, the reason it hasn't been tamed is that because unlike domestic horses, when people would try to sit on them, when domestic horses would buck until they essentially gave up, the Przewalski horses would sit down. So I don't know whether that's true, but I really love the idea that they just wouldn't do what people wanted them to do. They once ranged over desert and steppe habitats across Central Asia and in Europe. However, changing landscapes and a combination of overhunting and increased livestock and pressures, also occasional very extreme winters, drove them to extinction by the end of the 1960s. If not for zoos, they actually would have disappeared from the planet. After World War II, there were about 50 scattered in various zoos. Eventually, only 14 of those went on to survive and reproduce and found what is now a global population of 1,900 living in zoos and research centers across the world. One of those is the place where I work, the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute and National Zoo. This is where we have one of the largest research populations in North America and have been studying them for over 40 years. We've had 36 foals, including the world's first successful artificial insemination, and we also have the largest frozen gamete collection. Those are all really important tools when you're trying to save a species that went down to only 14. The good news is that from these 14 founders, and after 40 years extinct in the wild, the Przewalski's horses have returned, thanks to these reintroduction projects you can see in the pink areas. This is a really big story involving many international organizations, governments, science experts, local communities, and dedicated staff on the ground. And what Ching and I want to talk to you about today is one of the projects that's happening in the northwestern part of China, in the Kalamili Nature Reserve near Mongolia. And in 1984, the Xinjiang Forestry Department founded the Wild Horse Breeding Center. This was based on 18 horses coming from European and US zoos. They built that up to what is now the most successful P-horse breeding center in the world. And we have over 125 horses. In 2001, they began to release them into nearby Kalamili Nature Reserve. And this was a fantastic initiative. But at the time, not so much was known about the horse ecology. It also happened to be a very extreme winter, and the horses were inexperienced. Many did not survive. The next winter, the Kalamili staff decided it was too risky. They rounded up the horses and began to feed them, and continue to do that. Essentially, this becomes a semi-release rather than a reintroduction. Fast forward 5 years later, they asked the SCBI to help based on our expertise in satellite tracking. They want to get a better idea about the horse behavior, movements, and ecology. And so when I arrived in 2006 to Xinjiang, I was really excited. And I already had the answer because we needed to get those horses out as soon as possible. We needed to start tracking their movements in the winter, find out about their seasonal dynamics so we could better understand how to help them survive. I soon realized it really wasn't that simple. The Forest Department, the way they viewed, or their metric for success was about how many horses were surviving. They weren't so concerned about whether or not this population was becoming wild. And ultimately, if the project is losing too many horses, then they're going to lose support from the Forest Department, they're going to lose staff, and eventually be phased out. So I realized we needed to take a step back, and we started at that point to move the project towards a scientific framework, to collect key data to help us make better decisions about getting them back into the wild. There were other challenges as well. The local Kazakh herders living in the mountains would come down, the area would ice over, and they would bring the livestock into the valley, into the reserve over winter. During that time, providing competition for the horses with their livestock, also potentially spreading diseases, and also sometimes we had domestic stallions challenging the wild stallions, potentially having a hybrid offspring and defeating our whole purpose of returning that species. So as we started to move more in towards the scientific framework, collecting data, one of the first things we did was talk to the Kazakhs. We did interview surveys and found that 90% of them rely on livestock for their livelihood. They don't have other economic opportunities. They don't have very many educational opportunities. No one had really discussed the project with them. Although they were enthusiastic, and despite their concern about losing access to their pastures, they were interested in being involved. We knew the answer to this problem couldn't be, we have to keep the people and livestock out. We have to find a solution that's in balance with wildlife and with people, because they don't have a lot of other options. We started to collect movement data via satellite collars, which is a fantastic way of getting information quickly about their ecology. While I was working with the different groups to collar the horses, I learned a really important lesson that I've applied to any of the species or the countries where I'm working. And that is that conservation has to be built on science, but it can't ultimately be successful without people. Or it takes a village to save a species. It takes all the planets lining up to be able to launch this and make it a success. We have to have continued engaged stakeholders. And each of those stakeholders may have a different idea about what success looks like. So for example, the director of the Kalamai Nature Reserve, his top priority is about keeping the horses alive and keeping that program going. The liaison from the Forest Department is also interested in keeping the horses alive, but also wants to have international attention and wants to keep us happy to some extent. The director of the breeding center, his top priority is keeping a strong captive population, and he's the one that gets to decide which horses are released. So we really need him to be on board with our objectives in order to get strong stallions and mares for release. The Kazakh rangers helping out, their top priority is still about feeding their families, maintaining access to their winter pasture. National Zoo veterinarians helping with the collaring operation. Their top priority is about the safety of this horse and all the people who are involved in this operation. We have a media consultant from the Cologne Zoo. She's creating an educational video to help with educational outreach, hopefully broadening our funding and support for the project internationally. And me, I'm easy. All I want is a free-roaming, year-round, wild Przewalski horse population back in the Kalamai Nature Reserve. So I come to think about this situation as sort of a Venn diagram of conservation. And my theme music for this, if you can imagine, is you can't always get what you want. The idea is that no one in this picture is getting everything that they want. If we work really hard and engage with the stakeholders, hopefully everyone's getting what they need to the point where they're going to stay engaged and committed to the success of the project. Another important lesson for me is that we needed a smart, dedicated liaison to spend a lot of time on the ground, to engage with the stakeholders and keep things moving. So we were very fortunate to have Qing Zhao come along and take up the mantle while collecting his research for his PhD. And he's going to tell you more about our research findings and implementing those results.